Good afternoon, and welcome to the Grief and Healing After Suicide webinar. My name is Brandy Brooks, and aside from being the moderator this afternoon, I am a contract manager for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program, the sponsors of this webinar. Before I introduce our presenters, Kim Cates, Danielle Bulduck, Carly Burton, and Ruth Nelson, I would like to go over a few housekeeping issues. First, should anyone have any technical difficulties with either the audio or video for this webinar, please dial 1-800-843-9166. Again, that's 1-800-843-9166. And a Ready Talk representative will be more than happy to help with any audio or technical difficulties with viewing the presentation. Second, all telephone lines are muted except mine and Kim's, so please use the chat function located in the lower left corner to type any questions you may have. Given the number of participants, Kim and the survivors on the line will do their very best to answer as many questions as possible as we go along and at the end of the webinar during a question and answer period. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, let me introduce our presenters. I'll start with Kim Cates. Kim Cates is the Director of Grief Support Services for Samaritans. Her involvement with Samaritans began in 1991 when she volunteered on their 24-hour helpline. In 1999, she joined the staff focusing on the helpline's training and outreach and education programs. As the vision of a more active and vital survivor services program started to become a reality, her role evolved into working primarily with survivors and the development of the grief support services. Following Kim, we will also be hearing from survivors Danielle Bulduck, Carly Burton, and Ruth Nelson. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to Kim. Kim, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks, Brandy. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar. Just so you know, this is our first webinar, so we're novices, so just, bear with us. I think we're going to do a really good job because Brandy's been coaching us. I'd like to have the survivors that I'm working with, who are also part of the Grief Support Services team, just introduce themselves and let you know who they lost and sort of how they got connected to Samaritans. I'm going to start with Ruth.
Hi, my name is Ruth Nelson, and in 1988, my ex-husband, Gordon, took his own life, and I was really distraught. And then years later, a friend of mine lost her daughter to suicide, and I was able to help her because of my experiences. And that's how I met Samaritans for the first time. And then 17 years after my ex died in 2005, our son did the same thing. And at that time I had met Samaritans, and they had the Safe Place program, which was group meetings. And I just wanted to do something. So when I heard that they were having Survivor to Survivor Network, which involves volunteers visiting people in their homes who either are uncomfortable or aren't ready to go to a group, I was totally delighted, and I've been involved with Samaritans as a very active volunteer since then.
Hi, my name is Carly Burton. I lost my sister to suicide, my sister Betsy to suicide in December of 2006, and I started volunteering with Grief Support Services shortly thereafter, probably in 2008.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Bulduck. I lost my father to suicide in 1995. I was 11 years old at the time. I didn't get involved with Samaritans until much later. actually through an academic route. I was working on my master's for social work, and I was here as an intern in 2009. And since then, I've become involved in multiple ways, including with Kim and working with grief support services.
Okay, so now that you have a little bit of sense of who we are, we wanted to take a poll and see who you all are. So if you see on your screen there's a poll, if you wouldn't mind just checking off the different things that apply to you, that would be wonderful. We'll give you a couple minutes to do that, or seconds, not minutes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and skip to the results. So you can see there's a lot of people that work at social service agencies, which is great, and then a few survivors, and then people that are friends and family of survivors. So I think this will be very, very helpful to all of you, especially when you are serving survivors. And I think everybody serves survivors in one way or another, because there's so many of them out there. When we put this presentation together a few years ago, we kind of thought, what do survivors need to heal and to grieve? And we thought what people need is they need time. And not time like, time heals all wounds. I mean, I think there's a little bit of truth to that, but really just time that they can take care of themselves and figure out what happened to them and how they're going to kind of move on. Not get over it, but move to the different stage in their life. Another thing is you need a safe and gentle environment to heal and to grieve. You need permission to tell one's story. I think that's how we all make sense of loss. Loss happens very quickly often, so our mind gets it, but I don't think our heart and our feelings understand that this has happened. So telling the story helps make that more real. And then you have to be able to integrate this loss into your life. And what we find when someone has lost somebody to suicide, there isn't a chance to anticipate or prepare in any way. It's outside of the range of normal understanding. I feel often like you could tell someone who lost someone to suicide their loved one is on Mars, and that would make as much sense to them as telling them that they had died by suicide, because people just don't expect it to happen. And then suicide is often a very violent act. It's always traumatic, and it can be very hard to talk about. So it's because of these things, it can be very hard to do the things that you need with that safe environment and being able to tell your story. So I'm going to let Carly sort of give you a better sense of what happened to her and her family.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kim. When my sister Betsy died, my whole family, we were completely shocked. My mom and my other sister and I were very shocked. We had actually lost my dad less than 2 years earlier, not of suicide, but of a sudden cardiac arrest. And I think there was sort of an expectation within our family that more grief could not befall our family, that we were somehow exempt. And so we were really totally unprepared for her death, and for a time we really tried to explain it in other ways because it was just out of the range of our normal understanding. We thought about all the protective factors. She was in graduate school. She had wonderful friends. She lived in a city that she loved. She had a job that she really enjoyed, working with kids and families, actually at a social service agency that probably many of you, similar to the ones that many of you work at. And she was very talented and bright, and she did not fit my image, at least, of what I had of someone who would die by suicide. And so this is why her death and the grief that followed was so complicated. For me, not only did I have to reconcile the fact that my 37-year-old healthy sister was now gone, I had to reconcile the fact that she died by suicide, and it was something very difficult for me to wrap my head around. We had some close family friends who had lost a son to suicide, but I didn't really know how they coped, and I didn't know how to cope or how to help my mom and my sister cope. And my experience was just very, very limited. Plus, the other thing that's complicated is that it is traumatic and it is very difficult to talk about. You know, my sister was young. She died in California. We grew up in Connecticut, and we were relatively open with our family friends and with many of her friends that she did die by suicide, that she had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But what I found is that when I returned here to Boston and, you know, talked with friends and with colleagues, it was much more difficult for me to talk about it because they didn't know her and they didn't know who she was as a person, and I didn't want their image and their perception of her to be just clouded by how she died. So as a result, I really didn't talk a lot about it, and frankly, I still don't. This is actually the first time that I've been really public. You know, obviously I'm part of Samaritans, but I haven't been as public in the past. So this is the first time with all of you folks that I've been talking about it. The other thing that highlighted for me how complicated it was that I was actually able to kind of make comparisons. Since my father had died less than 2 years before of a sudden cardiac arrest, I was sort of able to watch how people's reactions to his death differed when I talked about my sister's death. And there was a lot of sympathy and empathy that comes when, you know, my father's death, it was sort of, it didn't come out of the ordinary. It followed the natural order. He was older. He was of a generation that, you know, was starting to pass, and so it kind of made sense. I was his daughter. You know, it wasn't like a child had died before he had died, even though actually he did die before his mother died. But and so it was interesting to see the sympathy and the empathy that came towards me after he died versus after my sister died, which was a lot. It was less, and it was a lot more difficult to talk about. One of the things that I always say is talking about suicide, especially the suicide of someone, you know, close to you. It's like a showstopper. It kind of sucks all the oxygen right out of the room. And I think that I'm really glad that we're doing this, you know, this webinar so that we can actually talk about it more openly, because that helps those of us who are grieving and have grieved to grieve a little bit more easily.
Thanks, Carly. I think when I think of people who are, you know, survivors dealing with this news, what I kind of see is this big rock that falls on their house, and it kind of destroys their house, and this rock spells suicide. So before they can even get to the loss, they have to kind of chip away at the suicide and try to wrap their minds around what's happened to them. At the same time, just like Carly said, they're not able to talk about it the way that they would if it hadn't been a suicide. You know, Carly and her family could talk openly about their dad. He had a heart attack. They didn't have to worry that he was going to be judged, that he wasn't a good dad, or they weren't good family members. People understood heart attack. As sad as it was, they got that. It didn't scare them in the way that suicide does. Also, I think often there's a curiosity factor when there's a suicide. If you tell someone that, you know, your father died of a heart attack, they're not going to ask for a lot of details because they have a vision of what that looks like. You tell your friends that your sister, you know, jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, they're going to want to know more. They're going to want to kind of get the gory details. For whatever reason, I think we need those sometimes. It's just so inappropriate. And also I think we want to make sure that it's not going to happen to us. We want to hear some magic answer that says, this is why it happened. it happened to Carly's family or Ruth's family or Danielle's family, it will not happen to mine. But unfortunately, while we're doing this, we're really shutting down the survivors, and we're not allowing them to grieve and to talk about this person in a way that doesn't have to defend them, which I think is really important. One of the things I think in our lives is we need to make sense of things, and when we have information, even if it's not the right information, if it's what we think is right, we feel better about things. So again, using Carly's example, her father died of cardiac arrest. She has enough information, she can kind of move on. But after a suicide, you don't have information. And the person that might have that information, and I really feel strongly that the person that dies by suicide doesn't have that information, that they're so busy trying to not be in this horrible place, they're trying to find help, they're trying to just figure out how to get out of this space. So I don't think they are of themselves when they die by suicide, but if anyone had a way to explain what just happened, it would be that person, and that person isn't there anymore. So what happens with survivors is they spend a lot of time trying to search for the why. They want to create a narrative. They want to put this puzzle together, but they don't have all the pieces. They start to become a private investigator, checking, phone bills and talking to the last person that talked, talking to the person who was the last person that talked to their loved one, trying to figure out, everything. Usually she has cornflakes for breakfast, but this day she had Rice Krispies. Just trying to pull together what happened on that day that caused this event to happen. Now, I think what's missing from that when they're doing this is that it wasn't just that day. It wasn't a certain amount of events. This was a long time coming in the sense that there usually is a mental illness when someone dies by suicide. So it usually isn't a sudden one thing triggers you to kill yourself. But unfortunately, when you have a suicide in your life, it looks that simple. Because what you know is the person was here and then an act took them away. So you really focus on that act, even though that's really not what was going on. And I think another problem is you end up reliving the event. And I say this, I usually don't, make a broad, sweeping observation, but I think almost every survivor I've met has felt like they are losing their mind because they continue to go over what happened over and over, almost as if they could just figure it out, then maybe they can fix it. And that's exhausting. This work takes a lot of time. It puts a lot of pressure on survivors, and it really gets in the way of their grieving. I don't know if you guys have examples of kind of that period of trying to figure it out, or I know, like, Carly, you went to San Francisco and...
Yeah, sure. I mean, we spent a lot of time, my sister was living in San Francisco at the time, and we were living, I was here, my other sister was in New York, my mom's in Connecticut, and we went to, after she died, we went to her apartment. We talked to all of her friends. We sort of had these interviews with her friends to figure out, all right, who saw her last? What did you guys talk about? You do become a private investigator. She did jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, went to the bridge, tried to figure out, okay, where did she do this? Like, where did she park her car? Where did she climb over? Sort of all that stuff. And for a while you try to convince yourself that, we tried to convince ourselves that there was foul play, that there must have been a crime that was committed. She must have been pushed, or she must have fallen, or, something else that would have reconciled who we knew as my sister and my mom, my mom's daughter, with this person who died by suicide. And it's very hard to reconcile that person who we know and loved with unfortunately the person that did this act. Although I agree with Kim. I mean, I feel like she was not in her right mind when she did it. So it is the process of trying to ask all these questions and relive her last days or her last moments to try and figure out what it was that that made this happen. And unfortunately, for me at least, I don't feel like you don't necessarily get answers to all those questions or get satisfactory answers.
Yeah, in my case, it was my ex-husband, and he was married for the second time, and my son was living with them, and they were completely convinced that there was foul play and had a very complicated conspiracy theory, and they never let that go. And my son died, 17 years later, still not convinced that it was really, his father's death was really suicide, even though he then did that. He did his own suicide. And their beliefs about my ex were very different from mine. I had been through some of his mental illness before we were divorced. He had threatened suicide before that. And I was pretty convinced that it was him and that he was not in his right mind. But I was having all of these pressures. And the conflicting stories, and of course they blamed me because I was the ex-wife. So I've really heard, that's another thing, is in the search for why is very often whose fault was it? And the blame can go to anybody from anybody.
Sure, just to add to everyone's comments, I think probably my age, I was 11 again when I lost my father, and my family dynamics had a lot to add to the way that I relived events. In the wake of my father's suicide, some facts of between my mother and my father had come to light, and so that information all came to me very quickly, but then following that, my family didn't really talk about this very much. Kim will talk about this later, but we lost the person in his death. So I really relived the events myself, privately, and I was young, so I probably still don't know all the facts, but it took me a rather long time to kind of put all the pieces together for myself, and it probably wasn't until the time that I was in college that I kind of had finished this reliving the events and putting the pieces together for myself, and came to the conclusion that he was not in his right mind and he was experiencing a great amount of pain, and that I came to a place of conclusion for that.
And I think that's a really good example of that this is a long process, and it can change radically as people get a better understanding of mental illness or situations that their loved one was in, but also when they get some more facts. Because often what happens is people in their lives have different pieces and different information, and they have to kind of pull it together. And that, again, can be, it's a lot of work, but it's, if you had one story and then all of a sudden you found out new information, that can kind of blow everything that you've done up, and you have to sort of start again. Like learning that your loved one was being treated for a disease, a mental illness. That, all of a sudden your loved one is a little bit different than what you thought. Things like that. So it can be very hard, or people sometimes keep information from people. So then they have to kind of figure it out themselves. And I think what we do when we don't know, especially as children, but I think adults do this too, we make things up. We find something that feels comfortable. I think they all hit on this, all the survivors that I'm working with right now, because within families there are conflicting narratives. And conflicting feelings and conflicting grief styles. And with the narratives, Ruth gave a great example. Somebody in, her son and his stepmom thought that, his dad had been murdered. So here's this other narrative. So while you're trying to wrap your mind around suicide and figure out what that means, there's other stories being told. And sometimes it's not as dramatic as murder, although I've heard that before. Often it's either the families don't say anything, or they tell certain people but not other people, or they make up a story, he had a heart attack, or it was a sudden death. what happens is that now families are saying different things to different people. They're nervous, who knows what. You know, a lot of times, and we're going to talk about this as we go along, people, because suicide can be public, and it can get in the news, or it can be in the community and people can hear about it, you have a sense that people are talking about it. So even if you're saying one thing, I think there's that doubt there that people know the truth. And also the narratives can change. Maybe the family's being very open that it's a suicide, but maybe there's pieces of the story that they're making sure that people don't know, or they've written it differently. So it can be as simple as family saying, no, he didn't have mental illness, he just, you know, it was because he got fired from his job, where other people in the family really think strongly that he had mental illness. It could be an example of, you know, blaming, just like we talked about. You know, the reason he did this was because he, you know, was, you know, married to the wrong person and she caused him to do this. And then other people have a different narrative. So it's really hard. It's not like a different death when everyone sort of is telling the same story and has the same facts. And again, I've used this word a lot, but it's just exhausting to try to pull all this together. The conflicting feelings, you know, one moment, you know, someone might wake up and feel incredibly sad for their loved one, that they were in that pain, where someone else in the family is incredibly angry with that person for leaving everyone. And that can be really hard if you're angry at the person that died and someone else is feeling bad for them. And then it can switch. You know, I think grief, people like to think that grief is very orderly, and you can kind of check off, you know, oh, I was angry yesterday, so I've gone through that stage. But I think when you've been in a process, especially as a survivor of suicide, you know that grief comes in waves. You can have conflicting feelings at the same time. You can go back to feelings. You can be angry at the person at the same time while you're blaming yourself for the event. So I think that it's very difficult. You know, grief is a very strong emotion anyway, but then you add the suicide and it just makes it almost unbearable, especially at the beginning. And then the last thing, just within families, conflicting grief styles. And I think this can happen in a lot of death. You know, you hear, oh, I'm really worried about her because she didn't cry at the funeral, or I'm really worried about him because he cried too much at the funeral, or, you know, she went back to work too soon, or he should be doing this now. But again, I think with suicide, people are much more on their own. People, you know, friends and family don't know what to say, so they either don't say anything or they say the wrong thing. And I just think people are all over the place on how they're sort of expressing this. And Danielle talked about, especially because she was younger, she was kind of left on her own. And I think that happens a lot with suicide survivors. They end up not being able to grieve as a family, but they need to sort of do a lot of the work separately, and that can be really hard. Now we're just going to talk about some of the feelings that people have after a suicide, and again, all these things getting in the way of them being able to grieve, getting in the way of them having a safe place, taking away the time that they need to heal. Again, I've never not heard a suicide survivor not say things like, you know, if only I had done this, if I had only taken him to the doctors, if I only hadn't put him in the hospital, if I only had called him more, if I had only, you know, made sure she took her medication, if they hadn't done this or she didn't do that. I mean, so there's all this sort of second-guessing not only what the person was doing, but also what the people in this person's life was doing, and more importantly, what they were doing. So the would-haves and the could-haves and the should-haves. And again, that just keeps going over and over and over. And we talked about this before, but that constant questioning and rehashing of the details and the events. And again, just feeling very guilty that maybe you missed something. And I've seen survivors like do this and not even have the correct information because they're feeling so guilty. So they forget all the things that they did to help their loved one and sort of say, I didn't do anything. And you have to kind of gently remind them, you know, you did do a lot of things. But it's just really hard to be left by yourself and have this person that you love gone, and you're left to kind of figure out what could have been different. And then really just self-doubt. everywhere. One, was I a good friend? Was I a good sister? Was I a good partner? If this person died, if we were so close, how could I have not known this? Why didn't they come to me? What if someone else in my life is suicidal? If I missed it with this person, how am I ever going to see it with anybody else? So that your foundation is just shaken up, and you really kind of don't even know how you kind of fit in the world anymore, or what your role is in relationships, because here this very important relationship kind of just disappeared, and you have no real reason why. You guys want to add anything about the guilt?
Yeah. Since I was divorced from Gordy when he died, and I actually had a lien on his salary for a small amount of back child support, I felt really guilty about putting pressure on him, especially because during our marriage he had threatened suicide, and during our marriage, towards the end of it, I started setting limits, knowing that life was easier when he was out of town, which was a giant shock, and then feeling very guilty about that even during our marriage, so that when he died and there was all this blame, I bought right into it. And I still, is there something I could have done? Is there something I shouldn't have done that I did do, like try to collect that money from him? And it doesn't go away. It gets clearer that this is not rational. The facts were that it was a small amount of money and he was making a large salary. But that's not the emotional impact of it. So, the guilt, as Kim said, it's sometimes not even factual, what you feel guilty and doubting about, but it's there anyway.
The next feeling that I think most survivors have, not all, but most, is shame. What are other people thinking of me and of my loved one? And we have a member on our board who talks about after he lost his nephew, that cars would drive by the house and slow down because people sort of want to make sense of this event, and they do things that really can be inappropriate, but they're, ask the wrong questions, pry too much, make assumptions, and sometimes those reactions are real, and there are also times maybe it's perceived. Maybe people, like Ruth is saying, she's feeling all these feelings that it's her fault, so she might project onto the people in her life that, well, they must think it's my fault too. So there's shame there, even though maybe her friends and loved ones don't feel this way, that are in her life, not some of the family, but the people that she was seeking support from. And then the secrecy. When there is any kind of secrecy, you feel shame because you know that you're not being completely honest. And there's, I think, just something that makes us feel embarrassed and feel like we can't be ourselves. And I think whenever we feel like we can't be ourselves, shame comes in. That feeling of failure. Again, we keep sort of saying the same thing, but I think that's so huge. What could I have done? And I failed in this relationship. And then just the public nature of the death. Carly's father, when he died, it wouldn't have made the paper. It wouldn't be a story. Where when her sister jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, that could have been in the papers. Or again, it doesn't even have to be in the papers. Communities know, when there's a death like this. People talk. So all of a sudden, something that's very private that you're trying to struggle with, that other people are also wondering about it and struggling with it. And sometimes, a lot of times not for the right reasons, just to sort of, like I said earlier, kind of the curiosity factor, but also I need to know what happened, why it happened, so I can feel safe that it's not going to happen to me.
Sure. So just speaking to the shame piece, my father died in the spring. I was just finishing up my 6th the 6th grade year in elementary school, and after the 2 weeks following his death, I was pulled out of school. And I returned and later found out that the school had had an assembly to explain my absence from school and had told everyone the nature of his death. So, then I returned. The following year, we went off to junior high and then following high school. So I felt kind of like everyone knew about this and that they were talking about it behind my back, and that, people who I'd gone to elementary school with, and then we had 7 elementary schools, so we kind of later joined a larger population that they had told everyone else. So it was kind of this, I guess, a dirty little secret that everyone knew about me, but none of them actually spoke directly to me about it. So I always felt, I grew up in a fairly small community, and I always felt that I had been labeled, the girl whose father killed himself. So that was difficult to deal with, and like him said, difficult to be myself when I felt like everyone else knew this part of me, that it became who I was, and that necessarily wasn't who I am.
Exactly. I mean, I think that happens. You get labeled the family that someone died by suicide, and I think that is a very hard label to live with. And again, you don't know who's thinking what, so that can be very difficult. I just want to see if there are any questions out there that you might want before we go on, that you might have about this. You can just type it in if you want. So we'll give you a second if there's anybody who does want to ask a question, and if not, we will kind of move on. All right, I don't see any questions, so we will kind of move on. The next part of our webinar, which is a fun word to say, is kind of how to help survivors heal. One thing that's really important is they need to ask those questions, and they need to do that investigation. And that might be hard as a friend or a family member to watch them do that, but they need to ask the questions. And they're going to have to continually ask the questions. It's not going to be a simple, we've kind of spoke to this, it's not going to be a simple, okay, I figured it out and now I'm going to let it go. They need that space. Now, we work with Jack Jordan, who is a pretty well-known therapist in the field of survivors. And one of the things he says is, ask those questions, investigate, put yourself on trial, but make sure that it's fair, that all the information is there, not just the negative. And really, I think, do that with someone you trust. It could be a therapist, it could be a good friend, it could be a support group. And I think sometimes as people that are trying to support a survivor, we might just want to very quickly dismiss it. They start saying, well, maybe I should have done this differently. Oh, no, you did everything great. Don't worry. Please, you were a wonderful mother. You were a wonderful sister. Where they're going to need to do those questions, and they're going to need some, like I said, some space to ask those questions. They need to know that they're never going to have all the answers, but again, it's okay to ask the questions until they're worn out. And they might get worn out, and then in a few years or 6 months, when something else might happen or just a really bad day, they might go back to those questions. But what the hope is that when they go back to those sort of ugly times, that they're a little bit shorter. They might be just as intense, but they're not as prolonged. Also, survivors knowing that it's okay to do this, it might help. That say, it's okay to keep doing this. Just as long as you're getting support and you don't feel unsafe, it's fine. You need to find trustworthy people who listen, who aren't afraid to keep hearing it, who aren't afraid to hear, my ex-husband shot himself, my father hung himself, and be able to talk about that and hear the details. And sometimes that is a therapist, or again, you might need outside help. But hopefully there are people in your life that don't get uncomfortable with this, because it's so important, if the person wants to be able to talk about those details. I mean, again, I think we forget, suicides aren't simple at all. You often find out that your loved one dies because the police show up at your door, or unfortunately you find the person, or, you know, it can be very ugly. And sometimes when you find out the news, you can be a suspect. We have a few of our volunteers who, when they found their loved one, and they couldn't even do anything until the police ruled out that there hadn't been foul play. So they got treated very badly. I know a family who they weren't treated as suspects, but because it happened in the house, they were not allowed to go back in their house for about 6 hours after they lost their daughter. So here they are, grieving, shocked, and they have to go to a neighbor's house and sit in their living room. So, I mean, you really need to be able to talk about those details. That's part of the story that you need to tell. And again, it is tell your story. So and you're going to have to find. They're going to have to find places where they can do this.
Can I have something?
Oh, sure.
Well, I'm kind of an activist, so one of the things that I really have done as kind of my activist reaction is to tell the story and to talk about suicide and talk about mental illness and to speak up when somebody blames a survivor for suicide, when somebody says things that are really hurtful about suicide, like my least favorite is, oh, they were angry, because mostly they were hurting. So in that kind of you know, activist, outspoken way, it's been tremendously helpful for me. And the other thing that's been really helpful is listening and doing the Samaritans work and meeting other people and, you know, who are going through like more immediate loss than I've gone through or than I am in now, and listening to their stories, which kind of puts mine in perspective. So the fact that the Samaritans motto, "You're not alone," really is important.
I think that that's a good place to move to the next slide, which is about education and awareness. I think, and survivors need to do this on their own time, learn about these things. I mean, it might be too hard for a family to immediately have someone say to them, oh, your loved one had mental illness. They might be thinking this is going to be a way for them to find comfort, but, you know, it might be as upsetting or as a suicide itself. That might not make sense. So I often, instead of saying when I meet someone, oh, did your loved one have mental illness, or what were the circumstances before this person died, I usually ask them, what was that person like? And then they can go there. But I do find that survivors do usually seek out information, because usually when a suicide happens, it is shocking to the family. They don't have, you know, that magnet on the refrigerator that says if you lose someone to suicide, call this number. So they really don't know what to do. So just having that awareness around mental illness, having awareness around suicide. Again, it's not just the crazy lady down the street with 6 cats that kills herself. It's everyday people who are struggling, often in secret. And it can happen to any family, unfortunately. But having to learn that and get that, and some of those myths, of just that the person, wasn't loved, or that there was something that outside people could have done to change this. So I think it's really important that they get a sense of what suicide really is. Also that there's a uniqueness of survivor grief. Carly talked about this earlier, that when her father dying, the experience was much different than when her sister died. And that to be understanding, you kind of know some of the things that you might encounter because it was a death by suicide, and have some patience with yourself for that, because I think it can be very scary. I know we have a volunteer who's been with us a really long time. Her name is Jane Curcia, and what happened in her life is her father died when she was young, and then about 15 years later, her brother killed himself. And I know for her that was really hard at first, because she thought, okay, I know what this looks like. I know what this, I've grieved before. I had a huge loss in my life when I was very young. I can do this. And then all of a sudden to have all this different feelings and waves and different things that she had to go through was very upsetting. And it also, again, made her feel like maybe she was losing her mind. And feeling very unsteady. So I think that that's really important. And also we're going to talk a lot about self-care, which is very important. But I'm going to let you tell.
Yeah. Well, both my ex and my son were bipolar. At least I'm pretty sure they were. My husband was diagnosed when he was 15, but I didn't find that out until after he died. His mother survived him. And my son was almost diagnosed when he was about 15 and went through a really hard time. But not quite, because he went at that point to live with my ex. And because they never admitted or thought that they were mentally ill. And so living with somebody who is mentally ill, and especially who doesn't admit it and thinks it's all your fault, is really, really difficult. And there are support groups for families of mentally ill people. But it turns out that there's very little support for somebody who loses somebody who's mentally ill to suicide, because that's really kind of a failure of the whole system. And so, I wanted to, my reality was really distorted by living with them, especially living with my husband, because of, after our separation, I learned a lot more. And it's a very intense reality, especially with bipolar people, that is quite different, or it can be quite different from the rest of us. So after my son died, I was looking for support for people who survived suicide from mentally ill people, and I've mentioned this to some other survivors in Samaritans visits, and there are not groups specifically for us, but it's good to compare notes because you feel so helpless. I think that the helplessness you feel for any suicide is intensified by the inexplicable behavior that goes with something like bipolar illness that's not under control.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to sort of piggyback on that, thinking about education and also thinking about, communities that may be at higher risk for suicide. I have to work within the LGBT community, and in light of the fact that last week was National Suicide Prevention Week, I looked up a couple of statistics around the LGBT community and the prevalence of suicide within that community. And actually DPH did a study in 2009, I think, that showed that 4.4% of the gay and lesbian community and 7.4% of the bisexual community have considered attempting suicide versus only 2.3% of the heterosexual community. That number, actually, that percentage jumps tremendously when you talk about the transgender community. Nationally, 41% of the transgender community have attempted suicide versus only 1.6% of the general public. And it goes up to 55% if the trans person has lost their job due to discrimination and bias. So I think it's really important, again, to be educated that this can also, you know, while Kim says that it definitely doesn't discriminate in terms of who it hits, it also, there are certain communities that may be at higher risk. And so when you guys are working with whatever populations you're working with, that's something to consider if you are working with people who have mental illness or people within the LGBT communities or other folks that have risk of suicide.
Right, and I think what's important here, because we're talking about survivors, is that if you're a survivor of someone who is gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and there's some shame that you might have or might perceive that other people have, then again, that's going to get in the way of your story. And I think that there's other communities or other issues, not that that's an issue, but there's other issues that can also cloud things. You know, family members who have been struggling with mental illness who haven't been able to be with the family because the mental illness has made them difficult to live with or impossible to live with. People that struggle with substance abuse. There's already this stigma around them. You know, these groups, you know, might even be considered like, well, maybe it's better that they've died, you know, because of things. And that's very hard for a family member to hear, because in this situation, they've lost their loved one twice. You know, if somebody can't be in their life because of their mental illness or their drinking or their drug abuse or whatever the issue is, they've lost them then, and then when the suicide comes, they've lost them again.
Yeah, can I add that there's another reaction, and Kim alluded to it for the outside world, but when my ex died, I felt relief, and I was shocked at my reaction. But having talked with other survivors, that sometimes is the reaction. And it's really the same kind of relief that you feel when someone has died after a long and painful illness. But you can talk about that one.
Right, and I think that might be a very scary feeling for a family member or a friend when they've watched their loved one struggle, when they've had to, you know, be up at night, not sure if that person is going to kill themselves or do something dangerous to themselves. But I think also when you have relief, it's not a separate emotion. You know, if you have a loved one who died by cancer, you're not at the, you know, wake high-fiving people and being really happy relief. It's more like, I knew how sick he was. He needed to go, or she needed to go because the pain was so great. And I think for family members who feel this, it can be very, very hard to watch someone go down this dark hole of depression or mental illness or substance abuse and feel so worthless and hopeless. Also, sometimes, and Ruth has talked about this with her ex-husband, their illness has impacted their life in such a huge way that there is relief, kind of like if you know, as a caregiver, maybe there's a little relief when there's a death because, you know, you don't have to live that life of caregiver. Again, there's guilt there when you feel that way, but it's a real feeling, and I think people need that space to be able to talk about it and not have people be shocked. I just with self-care, maybe just if you want to kind of mention some of the things that maybe help get you through it, or, you know, what kind of self-care things have you learned to do? You guys. They don't self-care. This is a group of survivors that don't take care of themselves, so I think I picked the wrong three. All right, so we can make some stuff up. If you did do self-care, what would you do? Or even if you want to change it too, maybe what things were helpful for you? Like what helped you kind of get through it? And maybe some of the things, just real quick, what really didn't help you? And I know you kind of touched on it, but I think this wouldn't be a bad place to sort of talk about that.
Reading and statistics. that was really helpful for me. I just have that geeky streak, and Kay Jamison's book, her autobiography about her mental illness gave me a little more insight into what it feels like from the inside to be bipolar. It's an extraordinary book. But Her Night Falls Fast, I think is the title of the suicide book, gave me so much information and just really clued me in about the mortality rate of mental illness because of suicide. And I felt much more balanced and kind of included in the world when I saw the numbers.
I think that you have to also, it looks like there's a question about the name of the book. There are two books by Kay Jamison. The one that she wrote about her struggling with bipolar is called An Unquiet Mind, and the other one is called Night Falls Fast, and it's specifically about suicide. But I think that's something that you really need to think about is sort of your basic needs and making sure they're fulfilled. I think that when people are grieving, what someone said, they bring you the 3 C's, caffeine, calories, and something else. Or something when they bring you food, it's all sugar and not good for you. And I think that it's really important to make sure that you're eating right, that you're sleeping enough, and I think that's a huge issue for a lot of folks. I know in my family, I would have trouble falling asleep, and my mom and my sister had trouble staying asleep, and, we all tried different things, but that was really important. For me, also, exercise is always really important for my own mental health, and I think that can be, really useful for folks in terms of their own self-care.
Sure. So I don't think I knew the meaning of self-care when I was 11, but I think basically by the time I had gone to college, being able to shed that label I was talking about before, and being with a new group of people who didn't know me and didn't know my past was definitely helpful in that. I think, like Ruth said, education and just educating myself about different populations in this topic has been helpful. It's led me here, and even though, I had been a survivor for 14 years before I had come to Samaritans, I think being a part of this community has continued to help. And I would just second or third, the sleeping is very important to me, and exercise, and my dog, because I'm a dog person, so just walking with him and all that good stuff.
A couple of things. When I meet survivors, I'm really careful not to give them advice, because I know that one thing that might work for one person is not going to work for another. But one piece of advice that I do give survivors is to go to their primary care physician and let their primary care physician know that they've had this traumatic event. Because grief is not only emotional, it's physical, and that I think there are issues, and the doctor, if you have a good physician, and if you don't have a good physician, find another one, should be asking you questions about, are you sleeping, how are you eating, and help you kind of decide, is this sort of, it's hard to say normal, but is this grieving, is it just grief and it's okay and keep going, or is it something a little bit more serious and you might need a little bit more help? And that's okay, but you're not in a good place to make those decisions, and maybe the people around you that usually help you with those issues are also grieving, so they're not able to see or they're not able to help you. So I think that is a really important thing. And I think also helping people find what works for them, and telling them that it might change. A support group might be really helpful when the loss first happens, but then down the line it's not helpful anymore. Maybe journaling was something that you did before you lost your loved one, but now that you've had this event, you can't journal for a while. And giving that person permission, because I think we can put a lot of pressure on us ourselves. So I think that's way. And just, the regular ways of self-care, and you can help maybe ask that person what helps make them feel better, help them figure out how to make time for it. I also think as friends and family, not asking if they need anything, because they certainly need something. They probably don't know what they need. And I think probably the best thing is just to show up and just be there and just sort of see what they need not sort of expect them to call. I think that I've heard that a lot from survivors. They hear from their friends and loved ones, call if you need anything. Well, sometimes as a survivor, you can't even get out of bed and put the right shoes on, so you're not going to call that person, or your mind is so foggy that you're not even thinking of things that would make normal sense. So I think as friends and family of survivors, we have to reach out, and we have to help. We work with a couple who said that they would have friends that would just take them out for dinner. They would just show up and say, we're just going to dinner. It's only going to be an hour and a half. This couple had lost their daughter. And then, so doing those things just sort of reminded them, and I think just kind of giving them a sense that they're not alone. And I think if you have to ask for help or continually reach out for it, that can make you feel very alone. So just to sort of be there. I think a really important thing is that survivors need to have space to remember the whole person. I think what happens is after a suicide, that person gets defined by that act. So I think it's really important to allow people to find ways to talk about their loved one, to remember good things, to even remember bad things, but also make sure that it's not just, the suicide is a part of their story, and it's a big part of their story because it's how their life ended. But it's certainly not the whole story. Now, I think with survivors, at first, they might not be able to remember the whole person. At first, that suicide might be what they have to deal with. But again, that switch to being able to start to remember some of the happier memories, start to sort of see your loved one as this whole person. Do you guys have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I've had a couple of real instances where it was oh yeah, and one was several years after my ex died. I found a photograph of him before we were even married, and he was looking with great appreciation into his fish tank. And I thought, yeah, that's why I married him, and that's the man I married. And it was really, really sweet. So that was a really positive connection. And he loved animals and he loved people, except when he was too ill. And then much later, my daughter, less than 2 years ago now, had a baby, and I was thinking how much my parents and my ex and my son would have all enjoyed being with her, the baby. And I realized that I missed them all similarly. And that was a really important thing. I missed them all, and they're all gone, and it wasn't, and these two are different because they died by suicide. They were whole people.
Great. This next slide, I just like the pictures. And it's just sort of a way to remember, these people, living, not in the way they died. And I think that that does take time, and helping people know that it might take time, I think is really important. The next slide, really being gentle with yourself, and I think that this is key. Because what I hear all the time is life changes. All of a sudden they go from life before the suicide and life after. So they find a new normal. And I think there's sort of a period where they're rebuilding and creating this new normal, but that's what's going on. And I think that people need to know to figure this out, that they have to take off some of the expectations that they have of themselves. They have to really start to realize that if somebody isn't supporting them, or if they're not able to feel okay around someone, then maybe they're going to have to give some space from that person. They're going to have to find some new ways to find support. I think that can be really hard, but it's really important. I've heard many stories of people who, thought certain people were going to be there for them, and they just weren't able to show up, and then other people that they didn't even think would be there really have shown up. We just want to see, again, if there's any questions out there before we kind of move on. Okay. One of the things we wanted to talk, right, if you have questions, remember to use the chat function for questions. Okay. One of the things, somebody had written, Cynthia, that it's so huge that people don't show up and that it's okay to let them go. And again, yeah, I mean, it is huge, and I think that can be really, really difficult. I think sometimes when that happens, when somebody can't handle what's going on, it brings up those feelings of shame, and you own that. So you want to stay in that relationship because you feel like, well, I've failed this person, or really that person has failed you, at least in that relationship. So I think that's a good point. One of the things that I've heard overall, too, with survivors is that where they find the most comfort is being with other survivors. That they know immediately that these people understand, that they don't have to defend their loved one, they don't have to defend themselves, they don't have to defend the feelings that they're having. And I remember I was at a Safe Place meeting years ago, and there was a young woman there, and she couldn't even talk at the beginning of the meeting. And Safe Place is our support group here that we run at Samaritans for Survivors. And she couldn't even talk. Her sister had to introduce her. They had lost her brother. And when she finally talked, in this 2-hour meeting, it was towards the end, all she did was say how great her brother was, and he was good, and people liked him, and just really singing his praises, which I'm sure were all true, but it broke my heart that, my thought was, if he had died of cancer, she wouldn't have needed to do that. I mean, she still would have said positive things about him, but it wouldn't have been in that way of, I can't even deal with my own feelings. I just need to make sure that you don't think badly of my brother. So, I mean, I think that's really important, to be with people who you don't have to do those things with. And sometimes, it takes time to find this group of people, but I think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, for me especially, I went to a grief support group after my dad died, and I tried going back, and it was a general grief support group, for all types of losses, and I tried going back after my sister died, and it really wasn't the same at all. And I feel like for me, part of what is also helpful for me in my process is being part of grief support services. I mean, I go to Safe Place meetings fairly regularly as a facilitator, and for me to help other people through their journeys is helpful for me on my own journey. And so I think it is really, it's the best group that you never want to be part of.
Over the years, Samaritans really realized that survivors are a group that don't get served. there wasn't a lot of support out there for them, and there still isn't. There needs to be more. I will hear often from survivors that, their therapist didn't know how to handle it. I've even heard from therapists who are like, oh, I don't know how to do that, which is, in my mind, in some ways, I think I can understand the fear, but really, again, it's just around being with them, hearing the grief, not being afraid of the story. So what we did was we started to create some programs, and like I mentioned, we have the Safe Place group, which is a support group for people, but we realized that for some people, a support group just wasn't going to work. It was too soon. They were going to have to hear other people's stories that might be really heart-wrenching. Also, meetings are at specific times on specific nights, and sometimes they just couldn't get themselves there. So we created a program called the Survivor to Survivor Network, which is an outreach program where 2 survivors go out and meet with a family member or a group of people. It doesn't have to be just one person. We've done this. We've gone into schools and done it after a suicide of a young person. Sometimes we've met people not in their home because they don't want it there. Sometimes it's with a bunch of family members. Sometimes it's just with an individual. And it's just a chance for that person to be with other survivors and to tell their story, to ask questions, because I think there are so many questions that survivors have, and again, who are they supposed to ask? They don't have anybody. So it's a really good program. Also, we are willing to meet with people if you have a client or someone you're working with that you feel that this would be a helpful thing. We're even willing to go to different agencies or schools. We really realize that we have to be very flexible and make sure that we're available as much as possible. This is a group that we could come out if you're working with a community that has a suicide, and you as the gatekeepers, you as the caregivers need support. We can come out and do this. People can have up to 6 visits. What we find is people don't usually need that many visits. Just a couple are really helpful. We also find that a lot of people that have the Survivor Network visits kind of transition into a Safe Place group, our support group. And again, just that finding a community of support. And Carly talked about finding, like, when she went to a general grief support group, that it was hard because it was so different. Her sister's death was so different, and she didn't feel good about it or didn't feel supported the way she needed to. But I've heard stories of other people, which is good, who have gone to groups like Compassionate Friends and different groups and have felt support. So I think also giving people permission, again, if it works, that's great, but if you don't feel comfortable, that it's okay not to go. And it's okay to change it and to find something different. Again, if they had a therapist before, they started seeing therapists and they didn't feel like this person understood, then it's okay to find somebody else. And we've mentioned Safe Place a bunch of times, but again, it's a place that people go. It's a group. It's facilitated by survivors. We actually have meetings in Boston, South Boston, Framingham, Medford, Quincy, and Worcester. So any information you need, you can just contact our office, and that's going to be at the end of the screen. Another service that we have, and Ruth always speaks so highly of this, which I think is great, because sometimes I guess my mind didn't get how important it is to have, like, that the helpline could be a place for survivors, which is kind of sad because I've been part of it for a very long time. But that is a place. Our 24-hour helpline is not just for people that are that are thinking about killing themselves. It's for anyone who's in any kind of crisis, and we train our befriending volunteers to talk to survivors. We train them, to know that that they need to talk about what they need to talk about, that you should ask the person about their loved one. Ask the person what their loved one's name is. We also let them know, and this is something important, I think, that it's really important not to ask someone who lost someone to suicide how they did it. That seems just extremely invasive, and it just seems like you're just trying to figure out sort of, again, sort of the gossipy thing. So again, they might talk about it, and that's their choice, but you don't want to ask that. But the helpline is someplace where someone can call, and again, it doesn't even have to be a recent suicide, although we do have people that pick up the phone and call the Samaritans before they even have the funeral or the memorial service. But we also have people that call who are dealing with a suicide that happened 25 years ago that they were never able to talk about, or maybe they just found out it was a suicide. And what we hear when people, there's been a death in their life and they didn't know it was a suicide, and then years later they find out that it was, what we find is they have to go back and start their grief process all over again. So I think it's really important that people are able to talk about this. So if adults have lose someone to suicide, they get the support they need so they can tell their children. So their children don't have to find out years later, or they don't have to always keep this secret from them. But if someone's not feeling support on their own, they're not going to be able to share this information with a child or other loved ones to help support them. We also have an annual event in January where it's just a time for people to come and gather and remember their loved ones. It's more of a sober event, but people really do seem to like it. The people that go, I think it's just a place for some people. It's maybe the only place that they're able to really think about their loved one with other survivors. Some people, that's really their only connection with Samaritans. And then the other thing we do is our annual 5K run walk, which this year is October 1st. And this is really a day of celebrating people who died by suicide. People have teams, they have T-shirts, we have scrapbooks where people can make memory pages. It's just really, again, a way to celebrate who the person was that they lost, not the fact that they had suicide. And then just, again, it's kind of a repeat, but just reminding people that are survivors that they need to take care of themselves. They need to allow themselves time. There's no timetable to this grief. There's no map. They need to create a safe and gentle environment. Unfortunately, with suicide, that often doesn't come, so they need to find it, which is unfair, but what they need to do. And they really need to give themselves permission to tell their story. And again, that might mean finding other people in their lives, but they shouldn't feel like if people can't hear their story that they're wrong for telling it. They just need to understand that the people they're trying to tell it to are not the right people to be telling it to. And this last screen is sort of for information about Samaritans. You can have our contact information and reach out to us, and if you want resources for an individual or for your agency. We also go out and do presentations to agencies around both prevention, which I think a lot of people know about, but also about bereavement services and survivor issues. So that's basically our webinar. Do you guys have anything to add? And also, again, feel free to type questions or comments. Also, just to let people know, Randy will be emailing slides of this presentation, so you have this as a resource.
Yes, I will definitely be emailing the slides at the conclusion or a few days after this webinar. And if anybody has any questions, we have approximately 10 minutes remaining, so please feel free to type in any questions that you may have using the chat function.
All right. Well, I think, either we did this amazing job of giving you so much information so clearly that you don't have questions, or probably more it's that there's a lot to take in. And that's another thing. I mean, these are hard stories. These are really hard stories to hear. So as gatekeepers and as caregivers and as therapists and you know, friends of survivors, I mean, we also need to take care of ourselves, because it is important that we are 100% when we're with survivors, and that can be difficult sometimes. So, and I think, anyway, so I just, you know, I think that that's important too. Brandy, you didn't tell me what to do if we ran out of time.
We actually have a question.
Oh, good, okay. I see. Oh, you know what? We missed it because that's so funny. Sorry. So, all right. Yeah, so the question is, when someone learns that you lost a loved one to suicide, what's the best way they have to respond to open the door for you? So kind of what should you say when you have a friend or family member who has lost someone to suicide? I mean, what helps you guys, or what helped you guys?
It's easier to remember the things you shouldn't say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I told someone recently, and the person said, "Oh, are you kidding?" I was like, "No, I'm not kidding. I'm not sure exactly why I was kidding about that." But I mean, I think just being open at, you know, sort of what I do if I learn someone. I mean, for me, because I am a survivor, I have a friend who's also a survivor, and you know, when we didn't know initially, and then it was sort of like, you know, I'm so sorry, and then just sort of opening the door, I think, as a listener, not asking too many questions, but I mean, it is a death like everything else, and I think that it's just being compassionate as you can be. I don't know.
Yeah, no. You know, I think that that's really good is, you know, I mean, people do say silly expressions like, "Are you kidding?" Or, you know, what was wrong with them? Or, do you know why they did it? That's the one I really love. Like, oh, yeah, I mean, this is a question that these people are going to be, the survivors are going to be dealing with their whole lives. And someone just says, "Well, do you know why?" It's almost like kind of getting punched in the gut. Like, I'm dealing with this, and someone's asking it like it's an easy question to answer, and this question has changed my life. And I feel very strongly that as a survivor, you have your whole life to ask that question, and you can ask that question, and hopefully with time you find some acceptance. But those are your questions, and in some ways those questions are a connection to your loved one. I think as people supporting survivors, we have no right to ask that question. It's not our business. All we need to know is Ruth lost her ex-husband and her son. She misses them, and that's the most important thing. How it happened, why it happened, not our business. And I think that can make a huge difference. I also think, and I said this earlier, is you know, kind of an open-ended question is, what was that person like? You know, I think that really opens a door, and maybe they're going to just focus on the suicide, and that's fine. Or maybe it's a good time for them to say some things that are positive, that just kind of reconnect them to that person in a way that maybe they haven't been able to, especially if the suicide is recent. One other thing, too, I think is, you know, Carly and Ruth and Danielle talked about kind of their connection to Samaritans and how that's been really helpful. And I think for survivors, some survivors, doing this kind of work helps. But I always want to make sure that people don't feel like if they did lose someone to suicide, now they need to be advocates for suicide prevention or mental illness or survivor issues, that should be open to them. And I really try to find ways that people can volunteer as survivors if that's what they want. But I also think that sometimes, people come to Samaritans and they get what they need and then they kind of walk away. And that's okay, because that's what they need to do, and I think that's fine. So it doesn't look like there's any other questions out there. We really appreciate people giving up an hour and a half of their afternoon. Let's see. One question was best practices to support survivors. Again, I think it's just helping them find resources and being someone there that they can talk to. And, if you're not that right person, let's say you're a teacher and you have a student that constantly wants to talk to you about the loss of their father, that might not be your role. So you might want to help find the person that can do that. I think, though, most people should just, let that person talk about grief and say things like that seem so simple, but people don't say it. Like, this must be really hard, or that's a really, sad story. Like, not in a judging way, but it is. I talked to a man today, and he told me that his wife died, and I'm like, that's awful. It is awful. And really listen. Because I think sometimes people get so scared that they kind of just give them pat answers, and that can be really hard too. I remember hearing a story from a woman, and there was a lot of, for no better word, craziness to the story. And at one point, I laughed because what she said was really funny, what happened. And she said, "Thank you so much for laughing. I've told this story like 100 times, and nobody saw the humor in this part. It's just a part of the story. I didn't laugh at the whole story, don't get me wrong, but it was because I was actually listening." And, she said it was just good to have somebody listen and to laugh with about some of the absurd stuff that was happening with her in-laws. It was craziness, and to have somebody acknowledge that. And I think also you now have information, so sharing that information, even if you don't, feeling comfortable giving information from this presentation, you can at least steer them in the direction of Samaritans.
One more thing, and that is to tell people that they're not crazy, if they're not. But it just, it's so easy to think that you just aren't getting something very basic when something very bizarre happens to you. And so we tell people that all the time, and we believe that we're telling them the truth.
And also just letting people know they're not alone. Everybody experiences death, but not everybody experiences suicide in their lives. And so a lot of times this happens to your family, and if you've never come close to having any experience with it before, you feel very alone. And so letting them know that they're not alone and there are people out there who have experienced this and who want to help.
Okay. Well,
all right. Kim, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So unless you or Danielle, Carly, or Ruth have any additional last comments, we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. So do you guys have any last initial comments, thoughts, information?
No, just thanks. I think just by giving up an hour and a half to learn about it, you're already supporting survivors. You're realizing that we can be supportive and helpful. So thank you.
Yeah. So just to piggyback off of that, I just want to remind people, as I said earlier, I will be emailing the slides as well as a link to the webinar so you can view it as a podcast later. In addition, be on the lookout for emails from DPH about upcoming webinars and trainings that we will be sponsoring. After you log off, just please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation. I hope that today you've gained more knowledge about the experiences and needs of survivors of suicide. And I want to thank you, Kim, Danielle, Carly, Ruth. You guys did a wonderful job. And I want to thank all of you for participating and learning more about this very, very important issue. So if no last comments, I will say, I would bid you all adieu. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. Please stand by.